Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here. This discussion series is part of 1111, a Creative Collective's Artist in Residence program. 1111, a Creative Collective, is a nonprofit organization based out of the San Fernando Valley, serving the greater LA area, that focuses on providing integrated and accessible arts programming through community events, public art, exhibition, and education. This program is sponsored in part by the Department of Cultural Affairs, Los Angeles. If you'd like any more information about 1111 or the upcoming discussions in this series, please visit 1111acc.org. We've invited contemporary artist Zeina Baltagi to join us as our resident artist through December 20th. Zeina is taking a deep dive into the concept of surveillance, investigating the blurred line between the observer and the observed. She has produced a very robust discussion series, which culminates on November 22nd, at which point she will enter our physical gallery space to continue working on a series that she began a couple of years ago titled Marketplace. I'd like to introduce Zeina further. Zeina is a Lebanese-American artist and educator. She was born in Stockton, California, and raised between California and Lebanon. She holds a Bachelor's of Art from the California State University of Northridge and an MFA from the University of California, Davis. Zeina's work explores and exposes the tensions within identity and social politics. It reveals intimate transformations in relation to lived experiences with physical, emotional, economic, and cultural mobility. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to Zeina.
The presentation of oneself, of our own community on a larger scale, is something that is ingrained at a young age within the SWANA, Southwest Asian, North African community. How we present ourselves is important to our community because representation has big consequences to our families and in our larger community. And there is a government factor to this, especially post 9/11, resulting in very real consequences. The fear post 9/11 stunted our progress in being able to address issues within our own community like patriarchy or homophobia because of the fear of feeding the Orientalist view of us as barbaric, terrorist, backwards, oppressed, and so on. So right now in the age of social media, we're more so able to have the dialogue and having the ability to connect with people, or if not connect, see people with similar values as ourselves. This social dialogue can have positive consequences, which opens up women's rights in a very real way. And we'll carry on with the conversations on like micro effects as well as macro effects. I'm really excited to introduce Yasmine Nasser Diaz and Loujain Bagger. Yasmine Diaz is a multidisciplinary artist whose practice navigates overlapping tensions around religion, gender, and third culture. Her recent work includes immersive installation, fiber etching, and mixed media collage using personal archives and found imagery. Diaz is a recipient of the California Community Foundation's Visual Artist Fellowship from 2019, with works included in the collections of LACMA, UCLA, and the Arab American National Museum. And she lives and works in Los Angeles. And I'm really excited for them to present their work. It's going to be very good. And then Loujain Bagger is also going to present their thoughts. They're an art historian, artist, and curator based in Los Angeles as well. And she recently graduated with their master's in curatorial practices in the public sphere from University of Southern California, where she's completed their thesis on contemporary artist in Saudi Arabia. Bagger currently works as an artist assistant at Shireen Gorgeous Studio and has worked as a curatorial assistant at Liminal Space and as a curatorial intern at the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum, and as an intern in education at the California African American Museum here in LA. In her free time, she is a member of the SWANA LA, a collective dedicated to advocating for the Southwest Asian North African community on a local and a global scale. And they received their BA in art history with a minor in art from Florida International University. And they are a wealth of knowledge and a scholar, actually. when it comes to this subject, and I'm very excited to hear them speak and then for you two to merge and have conversation together. I'm going to open it up now. And Yasmine, I would love for you to present a little bit about your work. You have a solo show up right now at Ochi Project's Soft Powers. That's really powerful. I took so many family members there, especially young ones, and I'm really excited to share more with more. So,
Thank you so much, Zeina.
Yes.
And thanks so much to everybody for coming. Yeah, I'm just going to launch right into it. So I'm going to share a very brief personal history and background and some of my work that is relevant, I think, to this conversation around censorship and surveillance within our communities and within ourselves, essentially. And I'm also going to be focusing more on how the culture of surveillance, has affected women in SWANA communities, because that's what I am, that's what I identify, how I identify and what I know best. And also because I think that women experience this, a lot of the burdens that come out of this in an unequal way. So I'm going to go right ahead and screen share. Portion. Okay, let me just adjust this a little bit. Oops. Sorry, portion of the screen. Okay, I think that is good enough. All right, sorry, I've never done the portion screen share, but I want to do that for some reason. Okay, so first of all, shout out to Mindy Colling, who I stole this, that's from the first page of one of her books, but it's so fitting for my talk. Oops. Okay. Yeah, so a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Chicago. My family immigrated from Yafet, Yemen, which is the image on the left. And on the right is the house that we grew up in Chicago. As you can imagine, our worlds, were very different. And so I think, I would say one of the main differences between the outside world that I experienced and that we migrated to is, the US being a much more individualistic culture versus a very tightly knit collectivist culture that, Yemenis, like many other people from the global South, come from. And so this is me. Look, I'm so cute. I used to be so cute. Anyways, so I think in this collectivist culture, there are so many pros, there are some cons too. But I can kind of consider this age, maybe I'm 7, kind of the age of when my own kind of self-policing began. I often joke as, that I started, this is when I started to become a covert agent. And I think I'm definitely not so rare in this. I think many people of SWANA background would say that we kind of readily accept the pluralities of our identities as a means of avoiding conflict and to just kind of safely navigate the different worlds that we inhabit. And so this presentation is mostly in a kind of chronological order, but I wanted to throw this piece in here now, because if I basically had to boil so much of this conversation down to one word, to me, I think about this word ebb. So if anyone doesn't know what ebb means, the easiest way to describe it in English is shame. But I think that, the actual, to understand it, it's much more than just that word shame. But I think it's this culture of ebb, of shame, is it's really kind of at the heart of so many reasons why we censor, or self-censor, or the reasons for a lot of the surveillance. So in these collectivist cultures where your reputation, your family's reputation is everything, it's the value of it is so high, and there are so many things that can tarnish that reputation. And again, for girls, that burden, I think, is so much heavier. And so that's why I chose this picture of myself as a young girl, again, about 7, still very much a child, but the age at when I first began to understand the kind of shame that my body could be perceived to cause. I'm not thinking about myself in any kind of sexualized way at all, but the adults around me, start teaching me that, unfortunately. Okay, so MTV. MTV, I was like obsessed with MTV as a kid. It was like a huge part of my education. And I include a lot of these icons in my work. And I would say that they kind of help to challenge the internal ib for me. Like there's all kinds of ib going on here that these icons kind of like represented to me. You know, Madonna in asserting her sexuality, her independence, Salt and Peppa, the things that they talked about. Again, like not having shame as a woman, you know, in terms of like your actions, your sexuality. And then other icons who really kind of challenged like traditional gender norms, you know, growing up in a very kind of like gender segregated household and community, you know, all of them kind of represent a whole bunch of other kinds of ib. And so just kind of fast forwarding to when like I was a late teen, and this is like kind of like the age when like, well, past the age, but that I kind of like knew that I essentially was probably going to like leave home. Basically, there was I made a clean break between the majority of my family for a very long time, because a lot of these, you know, the conflicts between their expectations and the things that I wanted for myself were too great to kind of stay within the community. Like that's kind of how strong the value of reputation was. Our community was like very tightly knit. I would say that Yemeni migrant communities tend to be maybe more insular than a lot of other Arab communities. And so that value of reputation and surveillance is maybe even higher. And again, I'm talking about like diasporic communities. So jumping way ahead many, many years later, I didn't talk about like leaving the family or a lot of my own past for a long time, but there were several things that happened along the way that led me to a point of I cannot not talk about these things anymore. So, you know, I'm including just a few examples of things. You know, one of the things that I faced, unfortunately, you know, was potential honor-based violence, and you know, in this age of like post 9/11, I think not even, you know, just after 9/11, but definitely more so after 9/11, when Arab and Muslim SWANA communities are being even more kind of highly scrutinized. Talking about sensitive subjects or talking about things that may feed into a stereotype or may make our communities look bad were even more difficult to have, you know, one of which being, you know, like talking about honor violence, which is not something that is only happens in Arab or Muslim communities, but it does, you know, does happen. The potential for it exists. And so, you know, I include this article about this one documentary being made about it that people were trying to censor. And then here's another article about specifically about, you know, this thing that was happening around, you know, when Muslim women would try to speak up about patriarchal violence. So I was seeing more and more of this and getting really frustrated because I had enough distance from my own family situation that I was ready to talk about it. But then there was this completely different thing that they sort of hampered me from talking about it. And that was like, you know, the society I was living in. And this is just an example of like one of the people that, you know, I found to be very inspirational, Muna Al-Tahawi, who she's a very like unabashed feminist. She swears a lot and I love it. And one of her, she really kind of encapsulates, you know, this that dilemma, or she you know, she kind of essentially says like screw your rock and like screw your hard place, you know, which is how it feels, I think, to be, you know, coming from, to be a person of Muslim heritage that wants to challenge certain, you know, norms. And so that book is excellent. I highly recommend it. Okay, so on to some of the work that I've made that I think kind of falls into these categories. So I think a lot of the policing and censorship is around dress, of course, and of course more so for women and girls. And this piece I made around the time of the burkini ban. I don't know if you all remember that, but it was maybe like 2015 or 16 when France was banning women, Muslim women, from wearing burkinis at the beach. And I found it very frustrating, the kind of conversation that was happening. This is before the Me Too movement, but everyone had an opinion about it. And what was frustrating to me was that here we are, once again, talking about what a woman should or shouldn't wear. And not really kind of talking about like the people around her and like, maybe you all should just mind your own business, basically. And so women are the ones that I feel like kind of have to constantly surveil themselves or censor themselves or think about that. So this is just an image of a woman at the beach, like being told to take off her bikini. And that's the photo that I used for the collage, which is like, I think over 50 years old. And I like to use that photo because it's like, here we are like so many years later and we're still talking about her, and like not these people around her. Okay, so, and then this is just a set, I made these also around the same time and still kind of thinking about, how we look at women and men, and also how religion is used to, kind of like inspire a kind of censorship. With this series of collages, I removed a portion of these men's bodies between the navel and the knee, which some like Islamic scholars will have said this is like their awra. This is the part of a man's body that should be covered. Whereas with women, that interpretation varies, but it's generally, of course, a lot more of her body. And so just kind of pointing out how like there's a lot less censoring for men to do, like, and then also like I was thinking about the bikini and swimming and how, when I reached the age of adolescence, like I didn't learn how to swim because of having bikinis didn't exist when I was a kid. But my brothers like didn't have to change anything. So, okay, this is another thing that happened that kind of like led to this point of me wanting to make more work and speak about these things. So Kandil Buluch was a very, very famous pop star in Pakistan who was killed by her brother in a so-called honor killing. It's probably the most widely covered honor killing, which is a disputed term, but the conversation around that really just kind of spanned like so many spectrums, and it was just another thing that happened that I think just gave me more motivation to speak a little bit more openly about my own experience. And so one of the first things I did was a series of collage work that was autobiographical. And the reason I include this is I had so much, I guess, hesitation around sharing this work and speaking about things like forced marriage or honor violence. And this is like one of the first times that I like spelled out a disclaimer. So it's like one of many, many, many disclaimers that I had. And so I just wanted to kind of like reference the I think complex nature again of like of being in this place of wanting to speak about the inequities and like maybe patriarchal violence, but also just recognizing how that can be used for, let's say, like right-wing rhetoric or just to continue demonizing a people. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about these things. And then this is another like little zine that I did in collaboration with another LA-based artist, Akina Cox, who she's in that picture with me. And Akina, as you can see, is white, but she grew up in a cult, essentially, a Christian cult. And it was really an important collaboration because we had, quite a few similarities. Both of us were estranged from our families. Both of us started, living these lives. We, both identified as sort of like covert agents as children and like did a lot of censoring. But it was important to me to show that like, here's this person that's like white, born and raised in the US and also experienced these things. So she also felt highly surveilled as a child. This is an image of an installation I did in 2018 at the Women's Center for Creative Work. And I specifically wanted to talk about this piece, which in Arabic says Hana bint Qamar, which translates to Hana, daughter of Qamar. Hana is the name I used to have. I changed my name many years ago. And Qamar is my mother's name. So this is something that I'd never heard growing up. I was often referenced as like the daughter of my father. And my mother's name was not, said out loud. I pretty much never heard people say my mother's name out loud. And that's quite common in a lot of Arab communities. And, it's kind of it's explained as a sign of respect, but there's something I think kind of disturbing about that, like to say a woman's name out loud, especially like amongst men. Like if a guy were to say to another guy, like, hey, I saw Qamar, and that's his friend's mother's name. It's a very dishonorable thing to say that. But this system of naming essentially kind of like erases women, I think erases their legacy and their identities. So that's why I made that. Okay, then these are samples of a series of collage work that I've done where, and these are, also part of that autobiographical body of work. Those are my sisters in those collages. And, in this first series of work, I hadn't done autobiographical work before. It was very vulnerable. And I was sharing a lot of information for the first time. And so I knew right away that I wanted to omit the faces. And so the first impulse in doing that was just a mode of protection, because I'm like, I'm giving the public already so much. I don't want to also give them our complete identities. But it also kind of got me thinking about the different ways that women are censored. In some parts of the Muslim world, women's images are literally censored. They may be pixelated, they may be scratched out, they may be photoshopped to conceal their identities or to cover them up if they're not dressed appropriately. And then also there is definitely a taboo around sharing images of the private, home or private sphere into the public realm. And so I consider these a way, like I'm censoring for my own reasons. So I feel like I'm kind of, subverting that censorship, using it for my own reasons, but also still protection. This is just an example of some advertisements where literally women's faces are blurred out or pixelated out. Okay. And then, so this is another installation that I did a year after the other one. And the title of this is Dirty Laundry. So, essentially like, sort of poking at that idea of how we censor, so like I think a lot of so many of us can identify with the notion of dirty laundry, right? But it was just something that I felt, and I know many others feel very strongly, like the pressure to kind of keep any dirty laundry hidden is very, very strong. And so I kind of wanted to poke at that some more here. This installation was done in Detroit, which has the largest Arab population in the country. So I sort of like made some pieces in here that, I knew, that more Arabs were going to be seeing it and I could speak to them more directly. So one of the pieces is this mirror that says "Esh yaqulu an-nas," which, is what will people say? Something I know I'm sure many of you heard many, many, many times. It's just ingrained in you, like, what will people say? What will people think? And, it was just kind of, I think for many of us, made very clear that what will people think is often more important than your own well-being, your own maybe mental health or physical health. Okay, so that's when I made the ayat piece. And yeah, this brings us to Soft Powers, the show that I have right now installed at Ochi Projects. And with Soft Powers, I wanted to go into kind of like more nuanced territory. I was thinking about, the skills that we begin to develop as kids. I think all kids begin to develop these skills, like some would call them manipulative skills, if you want to, which maybe sounds kind of harsh, but, we first start to learn like which parent we can get what from. But I'm thinking specifically about, young people who are living in diasporic communities, that have migrated from the global south to the global north. And, this show is all based on, Yemeni women and girls who have grown up in the US, but this notion to me applies to much broader communities, that kind of global south, community, because I feel like in having all these conversations over the years with this work, I've just learned how many similarities there are between many of these cultures. And so we learn very nuanced skills. I often reference code switching a lot, because I think code switching is like a segment of this, but I'm considering soft powers to be much broader than that, like not just language, which is what code switching usually refers to, but many, many other things, like not just verbal language, but like body language, the decision on what we, talk about, the kind of awareness that we have around us, how we, carry ourselves. And I've just been very much in awe when I see it in action, when I saw like other young women kind of make the switch and just knowing that they needed to behave differently or speak in a different way in different groups. And so, so the images in this work, these are fiber etchings. They're literally, most of these are velvet that I've etched. I apply acidic paste to the fabric and literally etch away part of it. These are all silk and rayon. And I apply this paste that eats away at the rayon. And I use photos as reference material for these, like I did with the collages, and they're all photos from my own archives and archives of other Yemeni women who've grown up in the US. And they're just, they're very casual photos. They're photos that we've taken of each other in our own spaces when we don't have to think about those soft powers that we have to use, and when we don't have to think about that surveillance. Sorry, I skipped the slide. When we can kind of let our guards down. There was something else that I want to say. Yeah, so, and for some of these women, so this is the first time that I went outside of my own family with this work. And when I told them that their identities would remain anonymous, that was definitely a factor in them allowing me to use their photos in the work. So it was a way to kind of like circumvent, again, that censorship. So by removing identifying features, I was allowed to share certain kinds of images and to talk about these things in a more open way. And so this show is right now installed in 2 places. The first place I installed it was at the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, which also has an installation. And the installation is based on a fictional pair of sisters. And within the installation, I have these 2 diaries that the author, Randa Jarrah, wrote the text for, and kind of goes into these wonderful little nuanced stories that talk about the kind of, again, like self-censorship that they do or had to do to kind of like, just go about their lives in public school versus home. And okay. That is it. Sorry, I went kind of long. I was trying to like keep that very brief, but I just wanted to end on this really lovely quote.
It's good. We're still good on time. Don't worry. We're good.
Okay, good. So yeah, I will pass it on to, who am I passing it on to? Loujain or?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Like your work, definitely, it's so important. It brings me to tears when it's spoken out loud. It's such a strange thing to even just talk about it out loud about these subjects. So just thank you.
Always. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was like such a beautiful like segue, and I'm like I'm gonna try to keep it brief, hopefully. But here is my little PowerPoint, and I included the little caterpillar from Alice in Wonderland because it just is like totally a SWANA representation with like the little SWANA feet and like having the hookah, shisha, like argida, whatever you want to call it, and just like, who are you? Because we're always like trying to be like, who is in our community, or who are we talking to? So I just want to thank everyone for being here today, and for Zeina. Did a wonderful intro, but in case y'all missed it, but I'm gonna just go briefly about who I am. I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, so here's a really cute picture of me. So yeah.
You're adorable.
Thank you. And I got my BA from Florida International University. I'm just gonna try to keep this really brief and go quickly through everything, and then I'll have some links and stuff that I'll put in the chat for people to see later on. So I just recently graduated, as Zeina said, from my master's in University of Southern California, where I wrote a thesis called Redress, Gender and Power in Saudi Arabia. So it's about contemporary Saudi artists. And I'm just gonna briefly go through all of them. Then I'll just like talk about it very briefly, and I'll put the links for each of the artists in their Instagram handles, their websites, everything, so you can check it out on your own time, including my thesis if you want to read more about it. But I am also very interested in like women and gender identity politics, about like, as Yasmine said, a lot of the time fashion is something that is, used within our community. So I'm trying to also think about that. I'm trying to think about women's rights. I'm trying to think about how we're perceived both in like our own community and like, as a global level, and, also like how artists can just express themselves like subtly, but also like, yeah. So I'm just gonna go through all the artists really quickly. And so this is the first artist, which is Hindin Mansour, and I only included one image of each of the artists, but you can feel free later on in the chat. I'll put all their stuff and you can check it out. But this is their Facebook project from the Facebook series. This is Abdelaziz Al-Gahlani, may he rest in peace, who is also the only male artist that I included, but I think it was very important to include him, especially since he's dead. This is My Own Guardian by Mustafa, Manal Daywan, Belqis Rashid, and here are all the links, but I will include them all. And I am very excited to be talking with Yasmine, Zeina, and thank you, Erin, for hosting and like curating this. And yeah, so I'll stop screen sharing and put all the links in the chat.
Take a moment. You'll make me cry. Thank you so much, Loujain, for sharing.
Yeah, I know I went super fast, but
No,
it kind of
so
makes up for
fast.
Yasmine taking a little bit of time. But I'm really excited to have tea with everyone and have this discussion.
You have your drink.
I'm sorry if I caused you to cut your presentation short. It was like a
I
marathon.
wanted to do it short anyways, so it's all good, and I have all the links so everyone can on their own time, like, read it. But
so I'm really happy now that you both shared. So what aspects should we address first? I mean, there's so much to talk about in reference with Yasmine's work and your thoughts, as well as with Loujain. We could work backwards and talk about the dress, clothing, and how we could address that in fabric form as well in Yasmine's. But
yeah, I think that's a really great place to start. Loujain, I'd love to hear more about your thesis. And if you could tell us all a little more, something else that in relation to dress is what Zeina's mentioning. We had talked about protection and how protection is such a big issue. The westernization or total assimilation kind of being simultaneously feared but also revered in a way. And I think that dress and protection of the woman's body is such a big part of that. Loujain, can you speak a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so all the artists that I picked were, like I mentioned, contemporary Saudi artists. And the reason why it was so important for me to pick them is because in art history, they're often neglected, especially like how art history is written in the Western gaze. And a lot of their work was very, very relevant in that time because I wrote it in between almost the laws kind of changing, the guardianship law, which if you aren't familiar with it, where a woman needs to kind of have a male guardian to kind of, get married, to work, to travel, to do all these sorts of things. And it's very patriarchal. And a lot of these artists were addressing it in very beautiful ways, including like fashion, but like in a cultural sense. So, men are known for wearing the shimagh, which is like a headdress, and like all these things. So they would like kind of do like the flipping of like having a woman dressed in like men's clothes and like a woman, you know, kind of like changing and playing around with that. And I think that's like one of the ways that they would play around with those kind of things to be able to kind of express what they're trying to say in a way that they won't kind of almost be censored or anything, because, and it's a very like clear way of almost showing what they're trying to say about like women's rights and stuff like that. And, you know, I think the male gaze, as Yasmine mentioned, is very like relevant in not just our culture, but in like so many cultures and societies that, you know, unfortunately we're all like kind of used to that.
Yeah. Patriarchal, definitely, it's a global issue. It's not something specific to the SWANA community, which I think Yasmine really touched upon. Is this fear of and presentation of ourselves and respect is so important in our community, and in a like post 9/11 era of that fear of like feeding into negative stereotyping and negativity, but it's really important to still address the very issues themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I sorry, this is related to that, but also different. Uh, just thinking about how things like dress have changed. It's really interesting. We started to talk about this in our like chat earlier, but like how in this post 9/11, how a lot of these issues have kind of changed, and how we see them in our own communities, or how we've policed ourselves. And, you know, I was just thinking about it a little more, how, you know, within my own community, within my own like insular Yemeni community in Chicago, there was a shift that was happening even before 9/11. And, you know, just an example of how like the different kinds of like censoring and surveillance can change in diaspora communities, and why. Like, I think that, you know, my family was one of the first, for example, in Chicago. It was like very early Yemeni community in Chicago. And I, you know, as the community grew, as more people came to the US, there was, I think, more pressure to maintain certain kinds of standards. And then, you know, in Yemen has periodically been, you know, North and South, like one country, two countries, like one country. And so when the North and the South became one, trust me, I have a point here. I'm like, sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, but this is related. When the North and the South united, like the North was much more conservative than the South, and it started to influence the South, and therefore other diasporic communities that had Yemenis from the South, like my family. So we started to feel it then. And then also, like, you know, Wahhabi Islam was spreading more and more. This is before 9/11. And that, like, in my day, women weren't covering their hair. My mom didn't cover her hair when I was a kid, and neither did a lot of the women in our communities, you know? So that started happening before 9/11. But then after 9/11, there was a huge jump, you know, in like the number of women that covered. And then I think also, yeah, again, how we policed ourselves. So it's just really interesting how all these other factors, these other external factors can affect, you know, how we are representing ourselves, like you said, Zeina. And yeah, 9/11 definitely, you know, like we were saying earlier, unfortunately, I think kind of stunted many conversations that maybe we would have had more freely, and that we are fortunately having more now, like around, you know, different kinds of human rights, or like patriarchal violence, that for a long time, many people, I think, were more hesitant to have, for fear of making our people look bad. It's a very valid concern, but I, you know, as for a lot of women, it's very frustrating, because it's like, you know, we can have multiple conversations at once. We don't have to sacrifice one thing for another. That was a very long response to that, but
No, that's totally, yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's exactly that point.
Yeah, I think like 9/11, depending on where you are, like globally, has like different effects. So like, I can see how like in America, it has the opposite effect, but in a lot of places in the Arab region where women, didn't really have these conversations either because of 9/11 and trying to show the West that they're having like a great image and women are not oppressed, there were more conversations and more allowances for women to have the rights that they weren't given for a very long time, and I think it's 9/11 is always a very complicated subject, and I think it has various like different experiences and results depending on where you are, in the region and like the world, and it's but even religiously because of 9/11, like we all had like a discussion before this discussion about how it's all affected about how we react to. So like like Muhammad becomes Mo and out of safety and fear, and we're all being surveilled, especially all three of us, although we're like Arab and have different experiences, we're all surveilled like more heavily by the US government because we are Arab and Muslim, and I think that causes a lot of very valid like paranoia and like, because we're being surveilled by the government, and then within our own communities, we're like, oh, auntie like is hearing us and like is gonna tell our parents about so and so, and I think that's not just special to the SWANA community, but it is something that is very much like focused on because it's something that like we don't grow out of, and I think that religiously too, since we're all Muslim, like we're all like taught from a very young age that Allah is always like watching us, which Allah means God, and like so I think the surveillance starts religiously and then governmentally and then like within our own communities and then family, and I think it's very like complicated and has so many layers that we're not going to be able to cover within like an hour, but I think we're getting somewhere. I don't know.
No, we are. It's just it's so heavy. It's so much to carry as a young child. And I think that that's something that I feel in very real time. Is like there is the more global the macro representation of our communities, but then on a very personal level, like you said, like aunties are always watching. My auntie Lish watched, actually, she just walked in and was like looking over my shoulder. So there's like that very real paranoia of like, and also, I mean, we want to respect our family. We want to be respectful and be respected so badly. I know I do. So I think that goes that's such a heavy burden to carry, to worry about constantly. And that's just my 2 cents of my feelings. Yeah.
Sorry, I like don't want to interrupt. And I'm like, how do I?
That's
No, and I think that like something, that's something that coming from collectivist cultures, like we and just I think as like immigrants or children of immigrants, like we understand and empathize. Like I think most of us have a great like a sense of respect and understanding for what our families went through, and even even with the conflict, even with the like, I had a massive like, conflict within my own family, and I went to extreme lengths to like have autonomy over my life, but I have never demonized my family or my community, despite the fact that like, there was like potential like violence that I would have faced for making the decisions that I made. But it's like yeah, to this day, it's like I don't demonize them. I understand like where they came from and like what shaped them and their decisions, and so I think that that's kind of goes back to that what I was saying earlier about how so many of us just accept these pluralities. Like there are certain things that I think some might call these kind of pressures. I think in many I hate to reduce it to this, but like Western societies, this pressure to kind of like be openly yourself in all realms of your life, in all facets of your life, to everyone, and there's like, for example, like in terms of like something like coming out, right? Like, I think that in a lot of Western societies, it's like celebrated to come out to everyone, don't hide who you are, and it's like, I think for a lot of, I mean, from what I know of other like SWANA friends are like, yeah, like that is just like not going to happen, like perfectly fine. And it's definitely easier for people, I think, I feel like more common, who maybe like whose parents are living in a different country, but it's like, it's just easier for everybody, least amount of conflict. It's just one example, but so many of us have different lives online or on one Instagram account versus another Instagram account or Facebook group. And it's like, this is just the way it's going to be. And I think, this is how it existed even like before social media. People just have different facets of their life. And I think there is a huge understanding where it's like, don't ask, don't tell. We don't want to know this. As long as the neighbors don't find out, fine.
As long as the neighbors don't find out, like that's it.
I have a question for you all in regards to exactly that. Like, do you think that this need to kind of compartmentalize is changing through generations within your cultures?
I would say yes, definitely. I think that, the older, the generation, like the longer a diaspora community has been in a certain place, you see changes. For example, like the Lebanese community, I think has a much longer history, or at least, they're great in greater numbers. And I see a greater variation in like, in different, I mean, you can't even call it like one community. It's so huge. But what I know of Yemeni communities, it's like, they're not that different, and they're smaller, again, tighter. But I do think that over time, depending on the place, and that there's definitely a change, like first generation versus second generation, like U.S. citizens, for example.
Right.
You could see that within different, and it's like the different families versus the larger whole of like mobility through like of mobilizing through the U.S. or I could only know of specifically the U.S. personally. But yeah, I think that definitely there's a shift between even children, between the older kid and the younger kid. If you're like multiple siblings within a family, there's a huge shift between the first child of the immigrant family here is a hugely different, vastly different experience than a middle or last or like more children further down. And same with generations, like first, second, third generation. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to interject for a moment, we do have some people commenting in the chat there. Would anybody like to unmute themselves? And it looks like somebody just put in a fairly long comment. Why don't you unmute yourself and say it out loud? Looks like Amal Amer. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. Just thank you so much, both of you, for or everyone really, for offering so many powerful things to be thinking about. That's like resonating with a lot of things I've been thinking about. But Erin's last question about generational differences really had me thinking about the compartmentalization and the idea of a need to compartmentalize is pretty complicated, but I think so much about how much pressure there was to perform like a certain version of what it meant to be Muslim, and how much pressure there was to kind of carry, especially when so many women put on hijab. Like right after 9/11, there was really like this, like being a walking PR machine, basically. And that really did some different things to compartmentalization. Whereas I feel like, I don't know, maybe more integration of different folks of color into popular media stories is happening now. I feel like teenagers are less engaged with that sort of performativity and more engaged in, at least in a different way. So that's just one of the things I'm thinking about, and I'm really excited to see the work that the kids end up doing.
Yeah.
You know, something I saw with people that were younger than me after 9/11 is like there was, you know, that performativity is definitely real, I think, but I think there was also very strong, like, you know, kind of like defiance. Like a lot of the hijab wearing that happened between generations, like there were a lot of daughters that put on hijab and their mothers didn't, you know, after 9/11, that it was, you know, some
Rebellion.
would say part of it, yes, in defiance as a way to really show their Muslim identity, you know, because of that, you know, just what was happening in the backlash. Um, I had another thought and it just, I can't remember.
Yeah, I had a thought like along with Amalza, the need to perform a certain way of being Muslim, that I am somehow lesser than or more so Muslim, or as a different layer, like there's one way to be Muslim. And I think that within me personally, it created, especially within all these fears and these subjects that we talked about, it created a blockade that I was almost scared. I internalized the Islamophobia, where I no longer have access, or I'm not allowing myself access to the text. So the Islam is it even from Islam, but it's like this fear of even of access to it and study of it. I know even myself, like we stopped reading the Quran a little more. Like it just became the relationship to the actual religious practice shifts with all of these heavy connotations to it. And that's my just a personal notation I've noticed is like, and it is difficult that like if I'm not wearing a hijab, you know, it's not, the visibility of it is gone down, but we still are. Even if we identify as atheists and we go far away from it, or agnostic in some forms. No matter how far away that I feel we pull ourselves from it, it's still a part of our identity and who we are. And yeah.
I remember what I was kind of going to say before.
Yeah, sorry.
And I feel like this is a generational thing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, good.
A little slow. No, but I think like, you know, in the past, and this is like, I think maybe speaks to a broader kind of like temperature in the US and in the world, but like there was more pressure to assimilate. Like after 9/11, people, I didn't see, you know, people of SWANA backgrounds like trying to necessarily hide. There might have been a pressure to be a model minority, but people weren't whitewashing themselves the way like more like my parents' generation might have done, or before that, you know. And my parents didn't do this so much, them specifically, but I saw this happening more. I grew up in a very diverse immigrant community, and you know, a lot of people would change their kids' names, for example, or not have their children not speak their, you know, native language, and especially if something, you know, like there was some terrorist act that happened, even if it wasn't in the US, but something that made, you know, that community look bad, they really tried to, you know, blend in and kind of like just whitewash signs of their own ethnic background or their culture. And so that is something that I think is just like very different, I think, about, you know, these different generations. Like maybe in that, if 9/11 was something that happened a long time ago, people might have tried to whitewash themselves more, but I don't think, you know, I think quite the opposite happened.
True.
Yeah, I do think that that is such an interesting point, Yasmine. We kind of discussed that briefly in our like pre-panel discussion, and going back to that first kind of question that I asked, I think Loujain brought that up, where, you know, feeling as though you need to protect your children and your family because of this type of westernization, or because of what's happening, especially in like immigrant communities, or once they're here in the US, but also feeling that, you know, very intense need to remain true and honorable to your culture, and how to balance that. And I think that there are plenty of immigrant communities that would feel that same kind of struggle, being pulled in both directions when it comes to assimilation. And in a post 9/11 world, it's just, I'm rambling a little bit, but it's just so interesting. That is such an important, I feel a lot of compassion to that point. That must be such a struggle. It is. Julio Carpio, hopefully I pronounced that right, just said this is such an important conversation, and it really, really is. Omar just put something into the chat there. Why don't you take a few minutes and say it out loud? We'd love to unmute yourself and turn your video on if you like. We'd like to see you too. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, definitely. I just wanted to say that Zeina brought something up earlier about, even when you're trying to distance yourself ethnically or culturally from where you are because of aspects that you can't really control, because of where you are or how people perceive you, there's always going to be that thing that's going to connect you back to who you are ethnically, no matter how hard you try to fight it. I personally have gone through this. Being identifying as an atheist and being able to do that, and I understand my privilege of being able to be an Arab living in America and having that privilege of choosing who I want to be. I still find it hard, even as an atheist, to hold my tongue back when people critique Islam or critique Muslim or critique Muslims in general, because I think it always falls back onto that idea of you have family, you have friends, you have people that you know, and that there's always that nagging feeling of someone is coming for the people you love, and you are not going to let that happen. And even if you try to distance yourself, there's always going to be something pulling you back in. And that's why community and or your ethnic makeup is so important, even in places where you come and try to conform. That's what I've seen here, even living here in Texas.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you. I identify as agnostic, and I say that I'm of Muslim heritage, and I know how difficult it is to talk about that. So first, I just wanted to say thank you, Omar, because for a lot of us, it's like that is like maybe the most censored thing is to talk about religion. If you are someone who falls into the category of being, an apostate, it's like a very, very bad thing. Maybe the worst thing, I would say. And Zeina, you and I were having a little conversation about this when you came to see the show. I often use different Islamic geometric patterns in my work because, in some of the collage work, I cut it into the paper, and it's like I cut the shapes out and leave a white background. So it's like white against white. So it's not very strong, but it's because of that imprint. It's like this paper is permanently altered with Islam being a part of it, because that's how it's like, even though I would say I was agnostic since I was like 6 years old, like before I knew that word, but that's how naturally, it just felt to me. But the culture, religion, these things are like very much intertwined, and they're always a part of you. And I totally get what you said, Omar, because it's like, this, like, I don't want to have a fight about Islam. I kind of have an equal opportunity, like, I don't know, discriminator against or aspects of organized religion. And, just today I saw somebody post something I saw a snippet of it. I don't know what they were talking about, but like this one guy was saying that like people can't be Muslim and in Congress because they